A flight attendant stops a black man as he steps into first class. He looks him up and down, frowns, and says, "Sir, first class is for priority passengers only." The man stays calm, but the flight attendant doesn't even check his ticket. Instead, he laughs and shakes his head. But seconds later, his face goes pale. His hands start shaking. And when he finally realizes who this man really is, it's already too late. What just happened? And why does the flight attendant look like his life is over? Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Stay till the end. You won't believe this twist. James Carter stood still, his boarding pass in hand, watching as Brad Turner, the flight attendant, refused to check his ticket. The cabin was filling up. Passengers placed their bags in overhead compartments, flight attendants assisted families, and business travelers settled into their seats. Everything was moving smoothly, except for this moment. Brad didn't look rushed. He wasn't concerned. He was confident. Confident that James was in the wrong place. Confident that first class wasn't for passengers like him. "Sir, I think there's been a mistake," Brad said again, his voice dripping with forced politeness. "First class is reserved for priority travelers." James held up his ticket. "I know. My seat is 1A. Brad barely looked at it. Instead, he chuckled and turned toward another flight attendant. "You see this," he muttered under his breath. "People try this all the time." James exhaled slowly. He had been here before. Not in this exact seat, not with this exact person, but in this same situation. The unspoken doubt, the assumption. A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A woman in row 3 glanced over. People were noticing. Still, Brad didn't feel the shift in energy. He was too focused on proving he was right. James looked him straight in the eye. "Are you sure you don't want to check that ticket again?" Brad smirked, shaking his head. "Sir, I don't need to." He was wrong. And in just a few seconds, he was going to find out the hard way. Brad Turner stood his ground, convinced he was right. He had seen this before. Passengers trying to sneak into first class, hoping no one would check. But today, he was making a mistake. A big one. James Carter remained calm, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet patience, like he had been through this before. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't arguing. He was just waiting. Brad sighed and crossed his arms. "Sir, I don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. First class is reserved for priority passengers. Your seat must be in economy." James didn't move. "I paid for my seat." Brad let out a small laugh. "Let's not cause a scene. If you just step aside, I'll check with the desk and see where you're actually supposed to be." Passengers around them started whispering. A woman in row 2 leaned toward her husband. "Did you hear that?" A businessman in row 4 looked up from his laptop, frowning. The energy in the cabin shifted again, but Brad was too confident to notice. James exhaled. "You still haven't looked at my ticket." Brad rolled his eyes and grabbed it from his hand. He barely glanced at it, expecting to find a mistake. But when he saw the seat number, his smirk faltered. Seat 1A. First class, paid in full. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. Still, he wasn't ready to admit he was wrong. "This must be an upgrade or something," he muttered, checking again. James tilted his head. "So, now you're saying I don't belong here because you think I didn't pay for it?" Brad's face turned slightly red. He glanced at another flight attendant for support, but she looked uncomfortable, sensing the tension. A few passengers were recording now. A younger man in row 5 discreetly held up his phone, capturing the moment. The whispers grew louder. A woman near the front, dressed in a business suit, spoke up. "If his ticket says 1A, why are you still questioning him?" Brad clenched his jaw. He should have stopped there. He should have just apologized, stepped aside and let James take his seat. But his pride wouldn't let him. "Sir, I just need to verify with the front desk. If you'll wait in the aisle for a moment." James's expression remained neutral. "I think I'll sit in the seat I paid for." He stepped past Brad and calmly settled into seat 1A. He wasn't asking for permission. He was taking what was already his. Brad stood frozen. His frustration was turning into unease. This wasn't going the way he had expected. Passengers were watching closely now. Then, the voice he dreaded came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to welcome a very special guest on this flight. Our CEO, James Carter, is on board today." Brad's entire world stopped. His stomach dropped. His throat went dry. CEO? Slowly, his eyes moved back to James, the man he had just tried to kick out of first class. James watched him, still calm. He had known this moment was coming. Brad's fingers twitched. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was too dry. This wasn't just an average passenger. This was the most powerful man in the company. The senior flight manager stepped onto the plane, his smile wide. "Mr. Carter, welcome aboard. We're honored to have you flying with us today." Passengers turned their heads toward James, their eyes widening. The whispers turned into shocked murmurs. Brad felt like he couldn't breathe. He had just disrespected his own boss. And the worst part? Everyone had seen it. Brad walked toward the galley, his heart pounding in his chest. His career was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. He had been so sure of himself just moments ago, so convinced that James Carter didn't belong in first class. But now, he had embarrassed himself in front of everyone. The senior flight manager followed him, shutting the curtain behind them. The air inside the small space felt heavier than before. Brad could barely breathe. "Explain," the manager said, his voice cold. Brad wiped the sweat from his forehead. "I thought he was in the wrong section. I just wanted to check his seat." The manager's jaw tightened. "Without looking at his ticket?" Brad swallowed. I assumed." The manager cut him off. "That's exactly the problem." He shook his head, lowering his voice. "Do you even realize what you've done?" Brad felt his stomach twist. He did realize it. He had judged a man based on nothing but his appearance. And that man just happened to be the most powerful person in the company. The manager exhaled sharply. "Passengers recorded the entire thing. Do you have any idea how bad this looks?" Brad had no response. He wanted to defend himself, to say it wasn't that serious, that it was a misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Back in the cabin, James Carter remained in his seat, silent. He had no interest in making a scene, but he also knew that moments like this couldn't be ignored. A businessman in row 4 leaned toward him. "That was ridiculous," he muttered. "I've flown first class for years, and no one has ever questioned me like that." James gave a polite nod. "It happens more than you think." The woman across the aisle frowned. "And if you weren't the CEO," she gestured to the flight attendants still working around them, "what would have happened then?" James sighed. He already knew the answer. If he hadn't been recognized, if his name hadn't been announced, things might have gone very differently. The manager stepped back into the cabin, clearing his throat. "Mr. Carter, I want to personally apologize for what happened today." His voice was firm, professional. "This is not the standard of service we uphold." James nodded, accepting the words, but he wasn't interested in apologies. He was interested in accountability. Passengers waited, watching closely. Would Brad face any consequences? Or would this all just get brushed under the rug? Moments later, Brad stepped back out. His face was pale. He avoided looking at James, at the passengers, at anyone. The manager turned to him. "You have something to say." Brad forced himself to meet James's gaze. His voice was quiet, almost shaky. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. I shouldn't have assumed." James studied him for a moment. The cabin was completely silent, waiting for his response. Finally, he spoke, and his words carried more weight than Brad expected. "The issue isn't me," James said calmly. "The issue is that you didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect." Brad's stomach dropped. Because that was the truth. If James had been anyone else, just another passenger, Brad wouldn't be standing here apologizing. The manager nodded. "Mr. Carter, I can assure you, we will be taking appropriate action." James held up a hand. "I'm not here to get anyone fired." He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen again." The manager gave a slow nod. Understood. Brad felt the weight of the entire plane on him. He had never been this exposed before. James sat back, closing his eyes for a moment. He didn't need to humiliate Brad. Reality was already doing that for him. Passengers were still watching, some still recording. This moment wasn't going away. And for Brad? This flight had just changed everything. Brad stood frozen, his mind racing. This wasn't just another bad moment. This was career-ending. James Carter leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to demand anything. The silence was punishment enough. The flight manager took a slow breath and turned toward Brad. "You're being removed from duty for the remainder of this flight." His voice was firm, no room for argument. Passengers murmured. A businessman in row 4 muttered, "Good." Someone in the back whispered, "About time." The tension in the cabin shifted. People weren't just watching anymore. They wanted accountability. Brad's stomach twisted. "Wait." The manager held up a hand. "Enough." His tone was sharp. "I don't want to hear excuses. You disrespected the CEO of this airline in front of an entire cabin. And let's be honest, Brad, if this had been any other passenger, you wouldn't have thought twice about dismissing them." Brad had no response. He knew arguing wouldn't help. The video footage said everything. James finally spoke. "I don't need a flight attendant removed because of me." He met Brad's eyes. "I need an airline that doesn't allow things like this to happen in the first place." Brad's breath caught in his throat. That hit deeper than anything else. The flight manager nodded at James. "We will be addressing this issue immediately." He turned to Brad one last time. "Collect your things." Brad clenched his fists, his pride screaming at him to fight back. But what could he say? He had judged a passenger based on nothing but looks, and that passenger owned the entire company. With shaking hands, he unpinned his name tag and walked toward the exit. He kept his head down, feeling the stares, the whispers, the weight of what he had done. James watched him go, but there was no triumph in his eyes, because this wasn't about one man. It was about something bigger. As the plane prepared for takeoff, passengers returned to their seats, but the energy in the air had changed. People were still whispering, still glancing at James, still processing what they had just witnessed. The businessman in row 4 leaned over again. "You handled that better than I would have." James gave a small nod. "It's not about how I handled it," he said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone who isn't in my position." The businessman sat back, thinking, and for the first time, so did everyone else. Because this wasn't just about one mistake. It was about a system that needed to change. Brad sat in the quiet office, staring at the folder in front of him. This wasn't just about saving his job. It was about facing the truth. For years, he thought he treated everyone the same. But today proved otherwise. He had judged James Carter without knowing anything about him. How many others had he done the same to? This moment wasn't just about one mistake. It was about unlearning everything that made him believe his assumptions were normal. Brad took a deep breath and picked up the folder. He had a choice: walk away and pretend none of this mattered, or change. And for the first time in his life, he realized change was the only real option. But here's the real question. Do people like Brad deserve a second chance? Can someone truly change? Or do moments like this define them forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you think, hit that like button, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that matter. Because conversations like this, they need to happen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.